November 12, 1943, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. The words escaped Fritz Enslin's cracked lips before his mind could fully process his surroundings. Did I end up in a Hilton hotel? His vision swam as he surveyed the barracks stretching before him, wooden walls painted a clean olive drab, windows that actually let in light without the jagged teeth of shattered glass, and most impossibly, a real bed. A bed with a mattress with sheets. White sheets that looked as though they'd been washed in something other than mud and diesel fuel. The scent of soap and pine disinfectant filled his nostrils, so foreign after years of cordite sweat and the metallic tang of fear that he'd lived with inside the cramped belly of his Panzer tank. Fritz's left leg throbbed beneath fresh bandages, a rhythmic reminder of the shrapnel still working its way out of his flesh. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a tank gunner in the 2nd Panzer Division, rolling through the French countryside with the absolute certainty that came from years of Nazi indoctrination. 2 weeks ago, an American shell had turned his armored fortress into a coffin of flame and screaming metal. 10 days ago, he'd woken up in an American field hospital, expecting torture, starvation, perhaps a bullet to match the propaganda films he'd watched in Munich. Instead, a nurse had offered him water. Real water, cold and clean, not the brackish liquid scraped from shell craters. The dissonance between expectation and reality created a cognitive wound deeper than any shrapnel could carve. The architecture of anticipation. To understand Fritz Enslin's shock, one must first understand the Germany he carried within him like a second skeleton. Born in Stuttgart in 1921, Fritz had come of age as the Nazi regime transformed every institution, every classroom, every casual conversation into an instrument of ideological formation. By the time he turned 18, he could recite Mein Kampf passages with the same automaticity that other young men might quote poetry or scripture. The Hitler Youth had taught him that Slavs were subhuman, that Jews were parasites, that Americans were mongrelized, weak, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing into a civilization teetering on collapse. The propaganda machine, operating with industrial efficiency, had created an entire cosmology where German suffering was noble, German violence was justified, and any mercy shown by enemies was merely weakness waiting to be exploited. When Fritz joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, he did so with the fervor of a true believer. Tank gunnery school in Munster taught him to operate the 75mm gun on the Panzer IV with mechanical precision. More importantly, it reinforced the lesson that he was part of a superior fighting force, racially and technologically destined for victory. The Eastern Front had tested this conviction, watching his comrades freeze to death outside Leningrad, seeing entire divisions swallowed by the Russian winter. Fritz had experienced his first tremors of doubt. But doubt was dangerous, more dangerous than Soviet artillery, so he'd buried it beneath layers of rationalization. The setbacks were temporary. The Führer had a plan. Victory was inevitable. By 1943, when his unit was transferred to France to counter the expected Allied invasion, Fritz had become a different kind of believer. Not the enthusiastic zealot of his youth, but a tired pragmatist who clung to ideology because the alternative, admitting that the last 4 years of his life had been spent serving a monstrous lie, was psychologically unbearable. He expected to die in France. Most of his original unit was already dead, bones scattered across Russian steppes, names carved into memorials that would later be torn down. Death seemed almost comforting, a release from the grinding exhaustion of constant fear. He did not expect salvation to come wearing an American uniform. The moment of fracture, September 29, 1943, a field outside Carentan, France. The shell struck at 1400 hours exactly. Fritz remembered this detail with crystalline clarity because he'd been checking his watch, calculating how many minutes until they could withdraw to their encampment for a meal of watery soup and black bread that tasted like sawdust mixed with despair. The explosion transformed time into something elastic and strange. One moment he was traversing the gun, tracking an American Sherman tank through his sight. The next, the world became orange flame and black smoke and a sound so enormous it stopped being sound and became pure physical sensation, a fist of pressure that squeezed his entire body. When consciousness returned, seconds or hours later, he couldn't tell, Fritz found himself lying in grass that smelled impossibly sweet. The autumn sun filtered through clouds of smoke, painting everything in shades of amber and gray. His left leg felt wrong, too heavy and too light simultaneously, and when he tried to move it, white-hot agony lanced through his nervous system. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard English. American voices speaking in that casual drawl he'd heard in propaganda films, the ones that portrayed Yankees as chewing gum chomping buffoons too stupid to fight properly. But these voices didn't sound stupid. They sounded calm, professional, almost bored. "Got a live one here. Leg's pretty torn up." Fritz tried to move, to reach for his sidearm, to do something other than lie there helpless. His training screamed at him, resist, fight, die with honor rather than face whatever horrors awaited him in enemy hands. The newsreels had been explicit. Prisoners were tortured, starved, worked to death in camps that made concentration camps look merciful by comparison. A face appeared above him, blotting out the sun. A black American medic, which should have been impossible according to everything Fritz had been taught about American racial hierarchies. The man's face showed neither hatred nor contempt, just the focused concentration of someone performing a skilled task. "Easy there, buddy. You're hurt bad, but we'll get you sorted." The medic's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away Fritz's uniform, exposing the wound. Shrapnel had torn through his thigh, missing the femoral artery by perhaps 2 centimeters, the difference between bleeding out in 90 seconds and living long enough to be captured. The medic pulled out a morphine syringe, jabbed it into Fritz's arm without ceremony. "This is gonna hurt before it helps. Hang on." The morphine hit his system like warm honey, dulling the edges of agony into something merely excruciating. Through the chemical haze, Fritz experienced something that would haunt him for decades. Gratitude. Not resignation, not defeat, but genuine gratitude that this enemy soldier was saving his life instead of ending it. It was the first crack in the ideological fortress he'd spent years building. The Hospital of Impossible Mercy. The American Field Hospital was a revelation wrapped in canvas and medical efficiency. Evacuated from the French countryside to a facility behind Allied lines, Fritz spent his first 72 hours in a morphine fog, drifting in and out of consciousness while doctors performed surgery on his shattered leg. The surgery itself represented a logical impossibility according to his understanding of how war worked. He was the enemy. Resources were scarce. Logic dictated that American medical personnel would prioritize their own wounded, letting German prisoners wait, suffer, perhaps die from preventable complications while patriots received care. Instead, an American surgeon, a man named Captain Robert Morrison from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, operated on Fritz's leg with the same meticulous attention he would have given an American GI. No waiting line, no deliberate cruelty disguised as medical necessity. Just medicine, practiced with skill and what appeared to be genuine concern for preventing permanent damage. "You're lucky," Morrison told him 3 days post-surgery, speaking through an interpreter who'd been a German literature professor at Columbia University before the war. "Another hour and we'd have been looking at amputation. As it is, you'll walk again, though you might limp." Fritz stared at the surgeon, searching for mockery or cruelty in his expression. He found only the tired satisfaction of a craftsman who'd completed a difficult job competently. This made no sense. Morrison should hate him. Fritz wore the uniform of a regime that had unleashed mechanized death across Europe, that even now was murdering civilians in numbers that made traditional warfare look quaint by comparison. But Morrison just checked his charts, adjusted his IV, and moved on to the next patient, another German prisoner, this one with abdominal wounds that required immediate attention. The hospital ward became Fritz's first classroom in a curriculum he hadn't known existed. Lying in a bed with clean sheets, changed every 3 days by nurses who treated infection control as seriously as frontline soldiers treated ammunition conservation, He observed the American medical system with the analytical precision he'd once devoted to range-finding calculations. Every morning at 0700 hours, doctors made rounds. They checked vitals, examined wounds, asked questions through interpreters. Fritz received antibiotics, sulfa drugs that smelled like rotten eggs, but prevented the gangrene that had claimed so many of his comrades on the Eastern Front. He received painkillers when the agony became unbearable, not as a grudging concession, but as standard medical practice. The food was perhaps the most disorienting element. Breakfast arrived on metal trays, scrambled eggs that were actual eggs, not the powdered substitute he'd eaten for years. Toast made from bread that contained recognizable wheat flour, fresh fruit, an apple shining red and crisp that looked like something from a pre-war memory, coffee that tasted like coffee, not the acorn and chicory mixture that passed for caffeine in the Wehrmacht. Lunch brought chicken soup with vegetables, carrots, celery, onions, all recognizable as individual ingredients rather than amalgamated into gray paste. Dinner might feature beef, potatoes, salad with actual lettuce, and sometimes, impossibly, cake. Not the dry ersatz cake made with substitute ingredients and hope, but real cake with sugar and butter, and a texture that melted on the tongue. Fritz ate slowly at first, certain this abundance was temporary, a psychological trick before the real treatment began. He waited for guards to come and take the food away, laughing at his naivete. Instead, they brought more food. When he couldn't finish a meal, they didn't punish him. They asked if he needed something different, if there were dietary preferences they should accommodate. The cognitive dissonance created a kind of psychological vertigo. Every Nazi doctrine he'd internalized insisted that this treatment was impossible. Americans were supposed to be cruel, wasteful, obsessed with their own comfort at others' expense. Yet here they were, spending resources, precious wartime resources, to heal their enemies. Transport to the impossible. 6 weeks after his capture, Fritz was deemed healthy enough for transport to a permanent POW facility in the United States. The journey itself became another lesson in the gulf between propaganda and reality. The Liberty ship that carried him across the Atlantic was crowded but not inhumane. Prisoners slept in bunks rather than being chained in holds. They received meals, not lavish, but adequate, 3 times daily. The latrines were crude, but functional. Most shocking was the complete absence of beatings, torture, or the casual cruelty he'd been taught to expect. A guard named Corporal James Sullivan from Boston, Massachusetts, struck up conversations with Fritz through hand gestures and broken German learned from a grandmother in Dusseldorf. Sullivan showed him photographs of his family, wife, 3 kids, a dog that looked like it had some terrier ancestry. The casual domesticity of it all felt obscene given the context. "War's gonna end eventually," Sullivan said one evening as they stood on deck, watching the sun sink into the Atlantic. "Then we all gotta figure out how to be human again." Fritz didn't understand all the words, but he understood the sentiment. It contradicted everything he'd been taught about the permanence of racial conflict, the inevitability of domination, the impossibility of peace between superior and inferior peoples. The crossing took 12 days. By the time they sighted American shores, a coastline that looked simultaneously foreign and strangely welcoming, Fritz had begun to recognize that his capture represented not an ending, but a beginning of something he lacked vocabulary to describe. Fort Leonard Wood and the question that changed everything, November 12, 1943, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Which brings us back to the question, the words that would define Fritz Enslin's relationship with his own past. Did I end up in a Hilton hotel? He hadn't intended it as a joke. The comparison arose spontaneously from his exhausted mind's attempt to categorize these new surroundings, using the only frame of reference available. Luxury hotels he'd glimpsed in Stuttgart before the war. Buildings that represented wealth and comfort so extreme they might as well have existed on another planet. The barracks at Fort Leonard Wood weren't actually luxurious by American civilian standards. They were functional military structures, built quickly and cheaply to house the sudden influx of German and Italian prisoners flooding into camps across the American heartland. But to a man who'd spent 3 years sleeping in a Panzer tank, or more precisely, sleeping in whatever frozen, muddy, or burning hellscape his tank had broken down in that particular week. The barracks represented opulence beyond comprehension. Each prisoner received their own bed, not a bunk shared with lice and two other men, but an individual bed with an actual mattress, not straw, not sandbags, but genuine cotton batting and springs, sheets and blankets that didn't smell like diesel or cordite, a pillow that hadn't been fashioned from a bundled uniform. The barracks had heating, real heating, not the desperate warmth generated by bodies pressed together in mutual suffering. Radiators along the walls hissed and clanked, but produced actual warmth, keeping the interior temperature above freezing even as Missouri winter began its assault. Windows had glass, all the panes intact, fitted properly into frames, keeping out wind and rain while letting in light. This detail obsessed Fritz for days, the casual wastefulness of having windows that served their actual purpose rather than acting as improvised ventilation after being shattered by blast waves. The showers revolutionized his understanding of what it meant to be clean. Hot water, actual hot water that came from pipes rather than being laboriously heated in helmets over campfires. Soap that produced lather instead of dissolving into gray slime. The ability to stand under running water for 5, 10, even 15 minutes without someone screaming about wasted resources. After his first shower, Fritz spent an hour examining his own body, the first time he'd been truly clean in longer than he could calculate. His skin looked different, paler but somehow healthier, without the accumulated layers of grime and chemical residue. The surgical scars on his leg showed pink and healing, kept clean by daily washing rather than festering beneath battlefield bandages. The daily architecture of Dignity Life at Fort Leonard Wood followed a routine that combined military discipline with unexpected moments of almost mundane normalcy. Each day began at 0600 hours with roll call, conducted in German by American officers who'd learned enough vocabulary to handle basic commands. Unlike the Wehrmacht's morning rituals, which often involved gratuitous humiliation, screaming, and the ever-present threat of violence for minor infractions, American roll calls were businesslike and brief. After roll call came breakfast. The camp mess hall became Fritz's second classroom in American civilization. Long tables accommodated 200 men at a time, sitting on actual chairs rather than standing or squatting in mud. Metal trays received food portions that challenged his understanding of wartime rationing. A typical breakfast, scrambled eggs, 2 eggs worth, he learned to recognize the quantity, prepared with milk and butter. Toast, 2 slices, with genuine margarine or sometimes butter. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. Fresh fruit, an apple or orange. Coffee with real sugar and canned milk. On Sundays, pancakes appeared, served with syrup that tasted of maple trees and American abundance. Lunch might feature sandwiches, actual sandwiches with sliced meat and cheese and lettuce and tomatoes, or soup with bread, or casseroles that combined multiple ingredients into dishes whose complexity suggested a culture that had never experienced genuine scarcity. Dinner brought variations on American standards: meatloaf, fried chicken, pot roast, always accompanied by vegetables that were recognizably fresh rather than extracted from cans packed years ago. The abundance wasn't unlimited. Portions were controlled, second helpings required permission, but the baseline standard exceeded anything Fritz had experienced during his Wehrmacht service. Even during the early years of the war, when Germany's initial victories had ensured relatively good supplies, soldiers ate adequate rations, not this casual plenty. What disturbed Fritz most wasn't the food itself, but what it represented. An economy so robust that even prisoners, enemies who had killed American soldiers, received nutrition that would have marked them as privileged civilians in wartime Germany. The cognitive implications were staggering. If America could afford to feed its prisoners this well, what did that suggest about German propaganda claims of American weakness and imminent collapse? After meals came work assignments. The Geneva Conventions forbade using POWs for direct war production, but allowed labor in agriculture, camp maintenance, and various support roles. Fritz was assigned to a work crew helping nearby farms with harvest, a detail that introduced him to his third classroom, rural Missouri. American farms in 1943 operated on a scale that defied Fritz's European understanding of agriculture. Fields stretched to horizons, cultivated by machinery that dwarfed anything he'd seen in Germany. The farmers themselves, many old men and women, the young men being away at war, treated their German labor with cautious civility. A farmer named Harold Peterson, 63 years old with hands like weathered oak, taught Fritz to operate a mechanical corn picker, speaking slowly and using gestures to overcome the language barrier. Peterson brought lunch one day, sandwiches and apples and thermoses of coffee, and shared his meal with the prisoners working his field. "Y'all probably ain't so different from my boys," Peterson said, his Missouri accent turning words into musical phrases Fritz struggled to parse. "They're over there fightin', you're over here workin'. War's got its own logic that don't make much sense from where I'm sittin'." Fritz wanted to explain that he was different, that he'd been indoctrinated, that he'd believed, still partially believed, in racial hierarchies that made such equivalence impossible. But his English was too limited, and besides, Peterson had already moved on to explaining the intricacies of corn cultivation in ways that suggested the conversation was over. The psychological battlefield evenings at Fort Leonard Wood brought the luxury of unstructured time, hours between dinner and lights out, when prisoners could read, write letters, censored but permitted, play cards, or simply exist without immediate threat of death. This empty time created its own crisis. For years, Fritz's entire cognitive bandwidth had been devoted to survival, calculating angles for gunnery, monitoring fuel levels, sleeping in 90-minute intervals between watches, assessing threat levels, managing fear. Every moment had demanded attention, leaving no space for reflection or doubt. Now, lying on his own bed, with clean sheets and a pillow, Fritz found himself with hours to think, and thinking was dangerous. The camp library maintained a small collection of German language books, mostly classics deemed sufficiently apolitical by American censors. Fritz began reading Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, authors whose works had been simultaneously celebrated and Bowdlerized by Nazi cultural authorities. Without the ideological filter, the text revealed complexities he'd been trained to ignore. More subversive were conversations with other prisoners. The camp held approximately 2,000 German POWs, representing every branch of service in every region of Germany. Some were true believers, still clinging to Nazi doctrine, despite evidence accumulating against it. Others had become cynics, recognizing the war was lost but trapped between ideological collapse and psychological paralysis. A prisoner named Klaus Hartmann, formerly a radio operator from Hamburg, had spent his first months in the camp organizing secret resistance cells, planning escapes that never materialized, holding tight to the belief that they were still soldiers fighting an ongoing war. By the time Fritz arrived, Hartmann had undergone his own transformation, still German, still proud, but no longer Nazi in any meaningful sense. "Look around," Hartmann said one evening, gesturing at their surroundings. "We're warm. We're fed. We're healing." Meanwhile, letters from home described cities bombed to rubble, families starving, the entire country being ground to dust. Who's the victor here? Us prisoners, or the soldiers still fighting for a regime that's murdering them along with everyone else? Fritz had no answer. The question itself represented a form of treason, not against Germany, but against the ideological structure that had given his life meaning since adolescence. To accept that surrender was better than continued service meant accepting that the last 4 years, all the suffering and fear and death he'd witnessed, had been wasted in service of a lie. The psychological resistance was immense. Fritz's mind generated elaborate justifications. The American treatment was psychological warfare, designed to weaken their resolve. The abundance was temporary, a facade that would crack once the economic strain became too great. The kindness was weakness, proof that Nazis had been correct about American softness and decadence. But these rationalizations crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence. Week after week, month after month, the treatment remained consistent. Guards followed regulations but showed no systematic cruelty. Medical staff treated injuries without discrimination. The food kept coming. The propaganda simply didn't match reality. The Wounded Made Whole winter arrived, and with it came Fritz's full physical recovery. His leg healed with remarkable completeness. Captain Morrison's surgical skill had preserved enough tissue and nerve function that Fritz's limp was barely noticeable. Regular meals had restored the weight he'd lost during years of military rations. His skin cleared up from various infections and deficiencies. For the first time since joining the Wehrmacht, Fritz looked healthy, but physical healing revealed the extent of his psychological wounds. The nightmares began around January 1944. Not nightmares about his capture or injury, but dreams where he was back in his Panzer, rolling through Russian villages, firing at targets that became civilians only after the shells hit. Dreams where he was standing in crowds at rallies, screaming Nazi slogans with genuine enthusiasm, his younger self's face twisted with fervor that now seemed monstrous. The camp had no psychiatrists. Mental health treatment for POWs was considered an unnecessary luxury. But the American chaplain, a Methodist minister named Reverend Thomas Clayton from Indiana, offered something like counseling. Clayton spoke fluent German, having studied theology in Tübingen before the war, and he maintained a non-judgmental presence that allowed prisoners to voice thoughts that might otherwise have festered in silence. "You're grieving," Clayton told Fritz during one of their conversations. "Not just for what you've lost, but for who you were. That person believed certain things absolutely. Now those beliefs are crumbling, and you're left with the question, if everything I believed was wrong, who am I?" Fritz found himself attending Clayton's evening discussion groups, voluntary gatherings where prisoners could debate philosophy, religion, politics, anything except escape plans or ongoing military operations. The discussions were chaotic, often devolving into arguments, but they provided something Fritz hadn't realized he'd been starving for: intellectual engagement that didn't begin with ideological premises. One evening, the discussion turned to the question of collective guilt. A prisoner named Otto Schneider, a former SS officer who wore his affiliation with defensive pride, argued that Germans were being unfairly blamed for actions committed by a small leadership cadre. "Most of us were just following orders," Schneider insisted. "We're not responsible for policy decisions made in Berlin." Fritz surprised himself by disagreeing. "I volunteered," he said quietly. "Nobody forced me to join. Nobody forced me to believe. I chose to participate in something monstrous, and that choice doesn't disappear just because I was lied to." The room fell silent. Accepting personal responsibility, not just for actions but for beliefs, represented a radical departure from the standard narrative of German victimhood that many prisoners clung to as psychological protection. Clayton nodded slowly. "That's the beginning of wisdom, recognizing that we're accountable for our choices, even when those choices were shaped by forces beyond our control." The education of enemy. By spring of 1944, Fritz had made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He wanted to learn English, not just survival phrases, but actual fluency. The camp offered basic English classes taught by American soldiers awaiting deployment, men who'd studied some German in school and saw teaching as preferable to physical labor. Fritz attacked English with the same methodical intensity he'd once devoted to gunnery calculations. He memorized vocabulary lists. He practiced pronunciation until his tongue learned to wrap around unfamiliar phonemes. He read children's books from the camp library, progressing gradually to newspapers and magazines that offered windows into American civilian life. The language learning revealed ideological assumptions he hadn't known he carried. English had no formal you, informal you distinction. Everyone was addressed with the same pronoun regardless of social hierarchy. This linguistic equality reflected deeper cultural patterns that contradicted Nazi teachings about natural hierarchies and the necessity of authoritarian social structures. American newspapers, even when discussing the war, showed a casualness about authority that would have been treasonous in Germany. Journalists criticized military decisions. Politicians attacked each other with gleeful abandon. Citizens wrote letters to editors questioning government policy. The chaos of democratic discourse looked like weakness from a fascist perspective, but Fritz was beginning to recognize it as a different kind of strength, the resilience that came from distributed decision-making rather than centralized control. He read about American industrial production, numbers that seemed impossible. 100,000 aircraft produced in 1943 alone. Ships launched faster than Germany could sink them, an economy that had transformed from depression to world-dominating powerhouse in less than 5 years. The propaganda about American weakness hadn't just been exaggerated, it had been inverted, a complete reversal of reality. More troubling were the stories filtering back from Germany. Letters from home arrived heavily censored but still conveyed information between the lines. His mother wrote about food shortages, about neighbors disappeared in the night, about the constant fear that permeated daily life. His sister mentioned that Fritz's childhood friend Hans had been killed on the Eastern Front. His father's letters grew increasingly cryptic, full of references that suggested he was trying to communicate something that censors would delete if stated openly. Fritz began to construct a mental map of two different realities. In one reality, the one he'd inhabited until September 1943, Germany was fighting a defensive war against inferior enemies, temporary setbacks notwithstanding, ultimate victory assured by racial and technological superiority. In the other reality, the one becoming increasingly difficult to deny, Germany was losing catastrophically, its people suffering immensely, its ideology revealed as a monstrous lie that had led the nation to ruin. The psychological pain of transitioning between these realities was immense. Fritz spent nights lying awake, staring at the barracks ceiling, wrestling with the implications. If Nazism was a lie, what did that make him, a victim, a perpetrator, both simultaneously? The festivities of transformation. The camp celebrated holidays with a generosity that seemed almost deliberately designed to highlight the contrast between American and German wartime experience. Christmas 1943 brought decorations, a tree in the mess hall, special meals featuring turkey and ham, and an array of desserts. Local churches donated gifts, small items like soap, playing cards, candy, and American Guards contributed from their own rations. Fritz received a package from the Red Cross containing chocolate, cigarettes, and a paperback book in English, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. He'd never heard of Twain, knew nothing about Mississippi River boyhood adventures, but the book became his constant companion. Reading about Huck and Tom's escapades, their casual freedom, their world unmarked by ideology or militarism, gave him a glimpse of what childhood might look like in a society that wasn't preparing its youth for conquest. Easter 1944 brought another revelation. A local farmers' association invited prisoners, carefully selected for good behavior, to an Easter celebration in a nearby town. Fritz was among the chosen, and he found himself sitting in a community hall decorated with pastel colors and spring flowers, eating potluck dishes brought by American families, listening to children sing hymns in English. An elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson approached him, her grandson acting as translator. "My boy's in Europe right now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of worry that mothers carry during wartime. "Fighting against your people, I suppose. But you're just a young man, same as him. I pray you all come home safe when this is over." Fritz tried to respond, to explain that he didn't deserve her kindness, that he'd participated in atrocities she couldn't imagine. But his English failed him, and besides, Mrs. Henderson had already moved on, offering cookies to other prisoners with the same grandmotherly concern. The cognitive dissonance reached a breaking point. How could this be the enemy? These people with their community potlucks and church socials and genuine concern for strangers. Where was the degeneracy, the racial corruption, the civilizational collapse that propaganda had promised? That night, back in the barracks, Fritz experienced what he would later describe as a psychological break. Not a breakdown, but a breakthrough, the moment when old beliefs finally shattered completely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, but also, for the first time in years, able to see reality without ideological filters. He wept. Not quietly, not with dignity, but with great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He wept for the lies he'd believed, for the friends who died believing those same lies, for the victims of Nazi ideology whose suffering he'd been complicit in through his service. He wept for the boy he'd been in Stuttgart, innocent and enthusiastic, who'd been shaped into a weapon by men who understood how to manipulate idealism into service of evil. Klaus Hartmann, sleeping in the next bed, heard him but said nothing. Sometimes grief requires witnesses, not comfort. The rebuilding of the self. The months following Fritz's psychological breakthrough were simultaneously harder and easier than anything he'd experienced. Harder, because he had to construct a new identity without the scaffolding of ideology that had previously supported his sense of self. Easier because he was no longer expending psychological energy maintaining beliefs that contradicted observable reality. He threw himself into self-education with almost manic intensity. The camp library became his refuge. He read American history, stories of revolution, expansion, civil war, and ongoing struggles to live up to stated ideals. He read philosophy, trying to understand ethical systems that didn't begin with tribal loyalty or racial identity. He read novels and poetry and technical manuals, consuming knowledge with the desperation of someone who discovered that everything he thought he knew was wrong and needed to rebuild his understanding of the world from scratch. The work assignments continued, but Fritz's relationship to labor changed. He was no longer a prisoner performing mandatory service. He was someone learning skills that might matter in a future he was beginning to imagine. He learned American farming techniques, mechanical repair, construction methods. He practiced English constantly, pushing past embarrassment to ask questions, make mistakes, improve. Other prisoners noticed his transformation. Some followed similar paths, experiencing their own ideological collapses and beginning their own reconstructions. Others doubled down on Nazi beliefs, interpreting their comfortable captivity as proof of American foolishness rather than strength. A few became actively hostile to Fritz, viewing his transformation as betrayal. One prisoner, a former SS officer named Werner Kramer, confronted Fritz in the barracks one evening. "You've become a traitor," Kramer hissed in German, "sucking up to the Americans, forgetting who you are, abandoning your people." Fritz looked at him calmly. "I haven't forgotten who I am. I'm remembering the person I was, the one who believed Nazi lies. That was the forgetting. This is waking up." The exchange might have escalated, but guards intervened before it could become physical. Afterward, Fritz realized something important. He was no longer afraid of men like Kramer. The psychological hold that Nazi ideology maintained through intimidation and groupthink had broken. He was free in a way that transcended his physical captivity. The war's end and the choice. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. At Fort Leonard Wood, prisoners learned the news through official announcements and newspaper headlines. The reactions varied wildly: relief, despair, numbness, denial. Fritz experienced something unexpected: grief mixed with profound relief. Grief for Germany's destruction, for the millions dead, for the civilization that had produced both Bach and Buchenwald. Relief that the killing had stopped, that no more young men would die for Hitler's delusional ambitions, that perhaps, finally, truth could emerge from beneath layers of propaganda. The camp administration began processing prisoners for repatriation. The Geneva Conventions required returning POWs to their home countries once hostilities ceased. But the process was slow. Europe lay in ruins. Transportation was chaotic, and American authorities were in no hurry to send potentially useful labor back to a Germany that needed every worker it could get. During this liminal period, Fritz made his most consequential decision. He didn't want to return to Germany. Not immediately, perhaps not ever. The country he'd left no longer existed. Physical Germany remained, of course, but the Third Reich had collapsed, taking with it the entire ideological structure that had shaped his youth. What would he return to? Rubble and starvation, and the psychological weight of collective guilt? America offered something different. the possibility of reinvention, of building a life defined by choices rather than by circumstances of birth. He inquired about immigration possibilities, learned about programs that allowed certain POWs to apply for residency, began filling out paperwork that would transform him from enemy captive to potential citizen. The process was neither quick nor guaranteed. Immigration authorities scrutinized applications carefully, rejecting anyone with SS affiliations or documented participation in war crimes. Fritz's record was clean, a regular Wehrmacht soldier captured in honest combat, well behaved throughout his captivity. His English was now fluent enough to impress interviewers. His letters of recommendation from American guards and civilian employers described a young man who'd undergone genuine transformation. On November 3, 1946, 3 years and 5 days after his first glimpse of Fort Leonard Wood, Fritz Ensslin received approval to remain in the United States as a resident alien with a path to eventual citizenship. The news arrived in a manila envelope containing official documents and bureaucratic prose that translated to something profound: permission to become someone new. The mechanic's creed Fritz moved to St. Louis, Missouri, drawn by the city's German heritage and robust manufacturing economy. He found work at a garage owned by a veteran named Samuel Cooper, who'd lost his left arm during the Battle of the Bulge and returned home with both physical and psychological scars. Their first meeting was tense. Cooper looked at Fritz's application, name, birthplace, previous military service, and his jaw tightened. "You were Wehrmacht?" "Tank gunner, 2nd Panzer Division." Fritz had learned not to lie about his past, but also not to offer more information than requested. Cooper studied him for a long moment. "Can you turn a wrench with those hands?" "Yes, sir." "Then I don't care what uniform you wore. War's over. Work starts at 7. The garage became Fritz's 4th classroom in American civilization. He learned to repair everything from pre-war Fords to the newest Chevrolets rolling off post-war assembly lines. More importantly, he learned the rhythm of civilian life, clocking in, doing honest work, receiving a paycheck, participating in the mundane miracle of ordinary existence. Cooper never discussed his war experiences directly, but sometimes late at night, when they were finishing up a difficult repair, fragments would emerge. "Lost my arm outside Bastogne," he'd say while Fritz maneuvered a stubborn bolt. "German artillery. Could have been your unit, could have been somebody else's. Doesn't matter now. We all did what we thought we had to do." This pragmatic forgiveness, not forgetting, not excusing, but acknowledging shared humanity beyond tribal loyalty, represented something Fritz had never encountered in Germany. There, forgiveness was weakness. Here, it was a kind of strength, the ability to hold contradictions without requiring simple moral narratives. He lived in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Kowalski, whose son had died at Normandy. She knew Fritz's background, everyone in the neighborhood did, the German accent being too distinctive to miss, but treated him with the same brusque maternal concern she showed all her boarders. Sunday dinners featured pot roast and potatoes, and Fritz was expected to attend, to sit at the communal table, to participate in conversations about baseball and weather and local politics. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Fritz became American. Not by erasing his German identity, that was impossible and undesirable, but by adding layers of new experience that complicated and enriched who he was. He learned to follow the St. Louis Cardinals, to appreciate jazz music that initially sounded like chaos, to navigate the complex racial dynamics of a city still decades away from truly confronting its segregation. He began writing, at first just letters to his family in Germany, updates about his new life, carefully edited to avoid highlighting how much better his circumstances were than theirs. But gradually, his writing expanded. He kept journals, recording his experiences, trying to make sense of his transformation. He wrote about the Hilton hotel question, about the moment when abundance replaced deprivation, about the psychological violence of having core beliefs revealed as lies. The testimony of transformation. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, Fritz became an American citizen. The naturalization ceremony took place in a federal courthouse, 37 immigrants standing together, hands raised, reciting an oath of allegiance to a country that had once been their enemy. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. The words carried weight that most native-born Americans couldn't fully grasp. Fritz was renouncing not just German citizenship, but his entire former identity. The boy who'd marched in Hitler Youth rallies, the soldier who'd fired shells across European battlefields, the true believer who'd absorbed Nazi ideology like oxygen. The oath was both ending and beginning, death and rebirth compressed into legal formality. After the ceremony, a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch approached him, seeking a human interest story about German POWs who'd chosen to stay. Fritz initially declined, uncomfortable with public attention, but the reporter persisted, and eventually Fritz agreed to tell his story. The article appeared on June 15, 1952, under the headline, "From Enemy to Citizen, a German Soldier's American Transformation." The reporter, a woman named Eleanor Mitchell, who'd lost her brother at Anzio, had approached the story with skeptical curiosity, but emerged with something deeper, recognition that individual human experiences complicated the simple narratives that made war psychologically manageable. Mitchell's article quoted Fritz extensively. "When I first arrived at Fort Leonard Wood, I asked if I'd ended up in a Hilton hotel. I was joking, but I was also serious. After years in tanks, after believing American propaganda about how prisoners would be treated, the reality was shocking. Not just the physical comfort, though, that was real. What shocked me most was being treated as a human being deserving of dignity, even though I wore the uniform of your enemy. That treatment, that refusal to dehumanize me even when it would have been justified, destroyed the ideology I'd built my life around. It forced me to recognize that everything I'd believed about racial hierarchies, about the necessity of domination, about the weakness of democracy, was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in emphasis, but fundamentally completely wrong." The article generated responses, letters to the editor expressing both support and outrage. Some readers praised Fritz's honesty and transformation. Others questioned whether former enemy soldiers should be allowed to immigrate at all, whether redemption was possible for those who'd served the Third Reich, whether American generosity was being exploited by men who didn't deserve it. Mitchell wrote a follow-up article addressing these concerns, interviewing other German POWs who'd stayed, as well as American veterans who employed them. Samuel Cooper appeared in the article defending Fritz. "I don't care what a man believed 7 years ago. I care what he believes now and what he does with those beliefs. Fritz Enslin is the best mechanic I've ever worked with, and more importantly, he's a decent human being who acknowledges his past mistakes and tries to live better. That's all any of us can do." The architecture of memory. As years passed and Fritz established his American life, marrying a schoolteacher named Dorothy Henderson, niece of Mrs. Henderson, who'd offered him Easter cookies in 1944, buying a small house in South St. Louis, raising 2 children who spoke English without accents, he found himself increasingly focused on memory work. He joined veterans organizations, not as a veteran himself. His Wehrmacht service didn't qualify him for American veteran status, but as a guest speaker, someone who could offer the perspective from the other side. Veterans of foreign wars posts, American Legion halls, high school history classes, Fritz spoke at all of them, always beginning the same way. "I was the enemy. When you picture the German soldiers your fathers and brothers fought, I was one of them. I believed Nazi propaganda. I served willingly. I participated in the machinery of conquest. Nothing I say today should be interpreted as excuse or justification. But if you'll listen, I can tell you how American treatment of prisoners challenged everything I believed and created the possibility of transformation." The presentations varied in reception. Some audiences listened with genuine curiosity, asking thoughtful questions about psychological indoctrination and the process of ideological deprogramming. Others remained hostile, unable to separate Fritz, the individual, from Germany, the enemy nation. A few veterans walked out, unwilling to hear from someone who'd fought for Hitler, regardless of subsequent transformation. Fritz understood the hostility. His American citizenship didn't erase his history, didn't eliminate the moral complexity of his position. He'd been both victim and perpetrator, victimized by propaganda that had shaped him from childhood, but also a voluntary participant in military campaigns that had caused immense suffering. Both things were true simultaneously, and anyone seeking simple moral clarity would find his story unsatisfying. But he continued speaking because he believed the story mattered beyond his individual experience. The American treatment of Axis POWs, generally humane, occasionally generous, consistently refusing to match Nazi atrocities, represented something important about American values, or at least American aspirations. The gap between those values and American actions regarding racial segregation, Native American treatment, and various imperial adventures complicated the narrative. But the contradiction itself was instructive. America's strength and weakness both derived from the tension between stated ideals and actual behavior. The Return. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, Fritz returned to Germany for the first time since his capture. His mother had died 2 years earlier. His father followed shortly after. The trip was ostensibly to settle the estate, but really it was about confronting ghosts. Stuttgart had been rebuilt, but the reconstruction revealed as much as it concealed. New buildings sat on foundations where old buildings had been bombed to rubble. Streets followed pre-war patterns, but the city spirit had changed fundamentally. The casual militarism of Fritz's youth had been replaced by a kind of aggressive normalcy, a determination to be European rather than specifically German, democratic rather than authoritarian. Fritz walked through his childhood neighborhood, searching for landmarks. The house where he'd grown up had been destroyed in a 1944 air raid. A modern apartment building occupied the space. The school where he'd first encountered Hitler youth recruitment was now a community center. The stadium where he'd attended Nazi rallies hosted football matches and rock concerts. He visited with former neighbors, people who'd known him as a boy. The conversations were strained, full of what went unsaid. Everyone had their own war story, their own transformation narrative, their own complicated relationship with the past. Germany had undergone collective denazification, sometimes genuine, often performative, always incomplete, and the resulting society was both familiar and alien. His childhood friend Georg Müller, who'd also served in the Wehrmacht but been captured by the Soviets, had returned to Germany after 3 years in labor camps that made Fritz's American experience look paradisiacal. Georg had lost 40 pounds, 3 fingers to frostbite, and any remaining illusions about military glory. "You were lucky," Georg said simply as they sat in a cafe that occupied what had once been a Hitler Youth meeting hall. "The Americans treated you like humans." "The Soviets treated us like we'd treated them, which we deserved, I suppose, but that doesn't make it easier to survive." Fritz wanted to argue that luck wasn't the right word, that there were moral and philosophical differences between how democratic and totalitarian systems treated captive enemies. But Georg was right in the essential point. Circumstances of capture determined experience more than individual merit. Fritz had benefited from fighting on the Western Front rather than the Eastern, from being captured by Americans rather than Soviets, from injuries that led to immediate evacuation rather than death in a French field. The trip reinforced Fritz's decision to remain American. Germany was his birthplace, his cultural inheritance, the source of his language and early memories. But America had become his home, not just geographically, but psychologically, the place where he'd undergone transformation, where he'd learned to be someone other than who Nazi ideology had shaped him to become. The writing of witness. In 1973, now 52 years old, Fritz began writing his memoir. He'd resisted for years, uncertain whether his story deserved book-length treatment, uncomfortable with the self-exposure that autobiography required. But he'd watched as the Vietnam War divided America, as young men burned draft cards while others deployed to Southeast Asian jungles, as the nation grappled with questions about military service, patriotism, and individual conscience that echoed his own experiences. The memoir took 3 years to write, working evenings and weekends while maintaining his job as shop foreman at Cooper's garage. Samuel had retired but kept the name. Fritz wrote longhand in German first, then translated his own work into English, finding that the double translation forced clarity and precision. The book, eventually published in 1977 by a small press specializing in military history, was titled From Panzer to Peace, An Enemy Soldier's American Transformation. It never became a bestseller, never appeared on national talk shows, or won prestigious awards, but it found its audience, veterans seeking to understand their former enemies, historians interested in POW experiences, German Americans navigating complex dual identities, educators looking for primary sources about World War II's aftermath. The book opened with the Hilton Hotel question, that moment of shocked disbelief when Fritz first encountered the gap between Nazi propaganda and American reality. Each chapter explored a different aspect of his transformation: physical healing, psychological destabilization, ideological reconstruction, cultural adaptation, and finally, the creation of a new integrated identity that acknowledged past without being imprisoned by it. Reviews were mixed but generally positive. Some critics praised Fritz's honesty about his Nazi indoctrination and his refusal to portray himself as innocent victim. Others criticized what they saw as insufficient acknowledgment of Nazi crimes or too much emphasis on American generosity. A reviewer in Commentary magazine wrote, "Enslin's story is simultaneously inspiring and troubling. We want to believe in the redemptive power of humane treatment, but we must also grapple with how a civilized person becomes complicit in barbarism in the first place." Fritz considered that a fair assessment. His story wasn't simple or comfortable. It raised as many questions as it answered. How much responsibility did individual soldiers bear for their regime's crimes? Could ideological transformation be genuine, or was it merely adaptation to new circumstances? What did it mean to be forgiven? By oneself? By former enemies? By history? The lessons without end. Fritz Enslin died on March 23, 1998, at the age of 77. The obituary in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described him as a German-American businessman, author and advocate for veteran understanding who spent his adult life promoting reconciliation and examining the psychological dynamics of war. His funeral drew an unlikely assemblage: fellow German immigrants, American veterans of World War II and subsequent conflicts, students who'd heard his presentations, neighbors who'd known him simply as Fritz the mechanic, and his children and grandchildren who carried within them the complicated inheritance of his history. During the service, his daughter Sarah read from his memoir. "I was asked once why I chose to stay in America rather than return to Germany after the war. The simple answer is that America gave me something I couldn't find in my homeland: the possibility of becoming someone new while still acknowledging who I'd been. Germany in 1945 required forgetting. We needed to forget our complicity, forget our enthusiasm for Nazi ideology, forget the enthusiastic crowds at rallies, and the casual cruelty toward those designated as other. America, or at least the America I experienced, allowed remembering. I could acknowledge that I'd been a Nazi soldier, could examine how I'd been shaped by propaganda and indoctrination, could recognize my own responsibility, and still be treated as a person capable of change. That's a profound gift, and I've spent my life trying to be worthy of it." The reading concluded with the passage that many readers cited as the book's emotional core. "Sometimes people ask me if my American captivity was easy or hard. The answer is both and neither. Physically, it was easier than almost any experience I'd had during the war, better fed, better housed, better treated than I deserved. Psychologically, it was the hardest thing I've ever endured. Having your entire worldview demolished, recognizing that everything you believed was wrong, accepting that you'd participated in monstrous evil while thinking you were serving a noble cause. That's a kind of death. But it's also a kind of birth. I died as a Nazi and was born as a human being, and that transformation happened because American soldiers and civilians refused to treat me as I'd been taught to treat others. They saw humanity where I'd been trained to see only enemy, and that vision changed everything." Epilogue. The question that remains. The story of Fritz Enslin raises uncomfortable questions that resist easy answers. How much credit should America receive for treating POWs humanely, when that same America maintained racial segregation, interned Japanese Americans, and would soon engage in conflicts marked by war crimes and civilian casualties? Does humane treatment of enemy soldiers represent moral greatness or merely baseline decency? Can individuals who participated in genocidal regimes truly transform, or does their past forever taint their present? These questions don't have satisfying resolutions. History isn't morality play with clear heroes and villains. It's messy, contradictory, full of people making choices within constraints they didn't choose and can't fully understand. What remains clear is that Fritz Enslin's experience demonstrates something important about human psychology and social systems. People are shaped by their environments more than most want to admit. The same person who could be molded into a Nazi true believer in Stuttgart could be transformed into a thoughtful American citizen in St. Louis. This doesn't excuse individual responsibility. Fritz never claimed innocence, but it does complicate our understanding of how people become complicit in evil and how they might escape that complicity. The American treatment of Axis POWs during World War II wasn't uniformly generous. There were instances of abuse, neglect, and cruelty. But the general policy of adherence to Geneva Convention standards, combined with the sheer abundance of American resources, created conditions where transformation became possible. Men who'd been trained to see Americans as weak, decadent, and racially inferior encountered evidence that challenged every element of that propaganda. Some POWs, perhaps most, went through this experience without fundamental transformation. They accepted humane treatment as lucky circumstances rather than evidence of ideological error. They returned to Germany or Italy after the war and resumed their lives, their core beliefs largely intact. But some, like Fritz Enslin, experienced genuine psychological revolution. The gap between propaganda and reality was too vast to ignore or rationalize. The kindness shown by enemies was too consistent to dismiss as weakness. The evidence of American industrial, cultural, and moral strength was too overwhelming to deny. For these men, the question wasn't whether to change, but how to live with change. How does one acknowledge that years were wasted serving evil? How does one forgive oneself for enthusiastic participation in monstrous ideology? How does one build a new identity when the old one has been revealed as constructed on lies? Fritz's answer was work, the daily practice of trying to be better than who he'd been, of teaching others about the seductive dangers of propaganda, of demonstrating through his life that transformation was possible even for those who'd fallen furthest into ideological darkness. His question, "Did I end up in a Hilton hotel?" became more than an expression of shock at physical comfort. It became a metaphor for the experience of having reality contradict expectations so completely that entire worldviews collapse. It represented the moment when propaganda meets evidence and loses. That moment of cognitive collapse is painful but necessary. It's the moment when growth becomes possible, when new understanding can emerge from the ruins of old certainty. Fritz Enslin lived through that moment and spent the rest of his life exploring its implications. His story isn't a simple tale of redemption or a comfortable narrative about American moral superiority. It's a complex examination of how people change, how societies shape individuals, how kindness can be more revolutionary than cruelty, and how the hardest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the psychological spaces where people confront their own complicity in evil and choose to become something different. The barracks at Fort Leonard Wood are long gone, torn down decades ago, and replaced by modern facilities. The POW camps that dotted America's landscape during World War II exist now only in historical records and fading photographs. The men who lived in those camps, both prisoners and guards, are mostly dead, taking their memories with them. But the questions they raised remain alive. Questions about justice and mercy, about punishment and rehabilitation, about the nature of human identity and the possibility of change. Questions that every generation must answer anew in contexts that shift but whose essential dynamics remain constant. Fritz Enslin asked his question in 1943, standing in a Missouri barracks, his wounded leg still healing, his mind struggling to comprehend the gap between what he'd expected and what he'd found. The question was half joke, half existential crisis. Did I end up in a Hilton hotel? The answer, developed over 55 years of subsequent life, was both yes and no. Yes, he'd found physical comfort and security that contrasted starkly with his previous experience. No, because the real luxury wasn't the bed or the food or the medical care. It was the opportunity to become human again, to shed the ideological armor that had made him less than fully human, to discover that enemies could show mercy, and that mercy could be more transformative than punishment. That discovery, that shocking, uncomfortable, ultimately liberating discovery, was Fritz Enslin's true inheritance from his American captivity. And perhaps it's the inheritance he left for all of us, the recognition that even those who've fallen into darkness can find their way back to light if someone is willing to hold a lamp rather than a sword. The question remains open, as all important questions do. But Fritz Enslin's life suggests an answer worth considering. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, but showing them why they were wrong to be your enemy in the first place. And sometimes the greatest transformation happens not through force, but through the radical act of treating people as human beings, worthy of dignity, even when, especially when, they've forgotten their own humanity. That's the lesson of the Hilton Hotel question. That's the story Fritz Enslin carried from a Missouri POW camp through 5 decades of American life. That's the testimony he left behind, not of American perfection, but of American possibility, the chance to become new while acknowledging the weight of the past. It's a story worth remembering, especially in times when propaganda once again threatens to divide humanity into categories of us and them, when fear makes cruelty seem necessary, when the hard work of seeing common humanity across lines of conflict seems too difficult to attempt. Fritz Enslin stood in that barracks in 1943 and asked his question. We're still answering it, still learning what it means, still discovering whether we have the courage to treat even enemies as human beings deserving of dignity. The question echoes across decades. Did I end up in a Hilton hotel? The answer shapes who we choose to become,